Dr. Amina Riaz stood alone in the small control room. The room smelled of paper and wet metal. Outside, the sea hit the rocks in steady time. The island was old. The people who built the final beacon used what they could find. Old radios, a broken satellite dish, pieces from a museum. They worked with their hands and little money. They built the beacon to speak for Earth. The beacon did not shine like a lighthouse. It sang. It could send sound, light, and a short map. The team chose what to send. They placed children's songs, garden maps, old poems, and one clear line: "We are here. We want peace." They put in small joys and human facts. They hoped someone would hear and understand. Amina held the metal key. Her hands were steady but her heart moved fast. Many people watched on small screens. She thought of the faces she had seen: children, old radio men, a boy who had written his name in the beacon's memory. She pressed the key. The beacon breathed. It turned the stored sounds into a beam. The beam left the island and climbed into high air. For a long time nothing answered. The world held its breath. In shops and homes people paused to listen. Sailors on a ship watched the black above with cups in their hands. 3 days later a tone came back. It was thin at first. The tone bent and slipped, like a fish in deep water. Then it matched a tiny laugh stored in the beacon. The laugh came from a child. It should have been gentle. Instead the pattern felt sharp, like a knife finding a seam. Amina listened. Her gloves bit her fingers. The lab lights hummed. The screen printed one short line: "We heard." The words looked small and flat. The message added a map. A dot slid over the map toward Earth. It moved fast from a dark place no probe had seen. Governments argued. Some said it was a trick. Some demanded action. Amina and her small team chose to answer with words, not guns. They planned to hide the beacon's exact place if they could. Hope mattered more than a quick strike, she told herself. Hours later every radio and phone made a sound together. The noise was like a bell underwater. Dead phones woke. Old satellites showed white blips. Machines that had not worked in years hummed. The sea pulled in a little at many coasts. It was small and wrong, and it made people fear. One old probe sent back a frame before it died. The frame showed a tall shadow and a ring of tiny lights. The lights looked like eyes. Then the probe went dark. A satellite lost power. The dot on the map grew a tail. The tail cut through human signals and made them scratch. On live news a man with steady eyes said, "No weapon seen." His calm face did not make people calm. A mother hugged her child and felt the child's breath stop for a long second. A ship's captain who had seen storms and war said, "I have not seen this." Amina walked to the beacon base and touched cold metal. The beacon had carried more than songs. It had carried the shape of human things: how humans light a room, how humans laugh, how they leave marks. The reply had read those shapes like lists. The thought made her stomach go cold. The lab screen flashed one more small item. It showed a child's name. Then one word came after it: count. The word did not explain. It felt like a rule without rules. Amina thought of every small thing the beacon had sent. Had those things become a list to be sorted? Later that night the island lost power. The lab went black. The last line before the screens died read, "We count. We come." Her hand shook as she lifted the receiver. The line sang with static and then a voice that was steady and close. It was not a child's voice. It was not quite any language she knew. The speaker said one short sentence in a tone that made the room feel small: "We have your number." The words felt like a blade and a promise. Right now. She did not run. She moved toward the old receiver like someone moving toward truth. Outside, waves hit the rocks with the same steady drum. She had sent one small message. The world had answered in a way no one planned. The beacon had echoed. The echo had become a question. The next voice on the line would change everything. The lab phone rang before dawn. Amina answered with her tired voice. On the other end was a calm woman who spoke fast and used a name Amina had read in many papers, the UN emergency line. The voice asked for facts, not feelings. Amina told the truth. She said what the beacon had sent. She said what came back. She said the word that had burned the screen, count. Within an hour the island filled with men and women in dark coats. They wore radios and badges. They brought papers and cold coffee. A team from the UN sat across from Amina. Military officers watched from the door. A simple man in a suit asked, "Are we safe?" His hands trembled only a little. Amina gave them the data. She spoke in short sentences. She showed the map. She pulled up the probe image with the ring of lights. She read the small line the lab had kept, "We heard. We count. We come." She told them about the tone that matched the child's laugh. She said, "They read our small things. They count." The room filled with a low noise. One general stood. He had steel under his eyes. "If they can count, they can choose. We must strike first. We must destroy whatever comes." Other voices shouted. Someone argued for shields. Someone argued for open talk with the public. The papers the men carried were full of black lines and red stamps. Amina listened. Her mouth pressed thin. She knew how easy fear made people. She also knew one other thing. Weapons could wake worse things. If they showed where the beacon lived, the reply would find it. If they shouted, they might give the enemy new things to count. She put her hands flat on the table and spoke slow. "We hide the beacon," she said. "We tell the world we lost it. We make them look somewhere else." A secret plan grew. A group of radio hobbyists, old satellite engineers, and a small Navy team came together. They met in the tower's dark belly. The plan used old tricks and older machines. They would fake telemetry. They would send a false return from a broken probe far from the island. They would mask the beacon's true signal with noise. They would make the map show empty cold rocks instead of warm lights and cities. Outside, the world reacted in other ways. Markets blinked. Flights were delayed. People in cafes watched the sky like it might fall. In a port town a fishing trawler left at noon. The crew joked to ease fear. They pulled nets and told stories. The sea was calm and red in the late light. When the trawler reached a quiet patch of water, its instruments went strange. The radio made a sound like a bird trapped in a bottle. Lights on the deck flared then faded. The net came up empty. The captain said the compass spun for a second as if it could not decide where north was. Later, the crew told a reporter they had seen a slow glow under the sea. The glow was a perfect circle that moved like a slow eye. Back at the island, the sat room watched a live feed from deep space. The maps showed one dot moving toward the inner system. The dot was large. It was not like a comet with a long tail of dust. Its movement was quiet and direct. Then more dots appeared. Tiny at first. They spread like sparks. The big dot had a pattern around it, a spray of small specks that drifted outward like seeds. In the emergency room a young analyst said what no one wanted to hear. "They are not coming as one. They come like many. They spread." The word spread like a chill. Some leaders still wanted to fight. They wanted to send missiles, to sweep the sky with lasers. The generals argued missiles could slow them. The scientists argued missiles could only start a noise the reply would count. The diplomats said the world must speak with one voice. The public wanted hope. The internet filled with people who called the new thing a miracle, a threat, or a test. Amina and her team worked through the night. They created false broadcasts that looked like the beacon was damaged beyond repair. They used old radios and even a child's music box to build a sound signature no scanner could trust. They dropped false heat signals in deserts and old factories to fool the alien count. They were small and clever. They sent shadows where bright lives had been. The plan seemed to hold. Satellites tracked the fake signals and sent back data that matched the lies. For a few hours it looked like the enemy would turn to the empty spots. The world exhaled just a little. Then a new feed cut into all channels. A weather satellite picked up a pulse beyond the orbit of Mars. The pulse was not long. It was a single pattern that repeated like a child's tapping. The feed showed a large object far out. It moved in a way that was not natural for a rock. Its angle cut close to the path of one of the oldest human probes. The probe, the one that had watched for decades, blinked. It sent one image before its circuits failed. The image showed the same ring of tiny lights as before. It showed the shadow of something that should not have fit in a picture taken so far out. The room went very quiet. Men and women in uniforms looked at each other like strangers. The leader on the screen said one word, cluster. The microphones picked up whispers. The map updated. More dots blinked into being. They spread across the sky like a slow net. Amina felt the cold at her bones. The fake signals did not matter now. The enemy could come with many small parts and search every bright thing. The world could try to hide. The world could try to lie. Or it could try to fight and risk making itself easier to count. As the emergency meeting broke, one pilot in a small plane watched the sky. He saw a black thread slip between stars. He thought of the trawler and its circle of light. He thought of a child's laugh that had become a key. He felt anger and pride at the same time. Humans had made the beacon. Humans had sent hope. Now the choice belonged to humans again. Outside, the island's lighthouse blinked at the sea. The team sent one last signal into the air, not to the stars, but to people. It was a short loop of song and a voice that said, "We will not be easy to count." The song threw a small light into the dark. Far away, in the deep black beyond Pluto, the cluster of dots moved like seeds on a wind. One by one the tiny specks turned, and they began to aim. The sky, for the first time in many years, felt like a room being closed around the planet. The feed went black. The emergency line chimed again. Someone in the UN press room said, "Get ready." Amina pressed her hands together. She thought of the trawler, the captain, the child's laugh, and the maps of small towns. She thought of hiding and lying and of the long cold that might follow. She knew one thing hard and true: the world had sent a message. The world had new enemies who counted what humans valued. The next move would not be on a map. It would be in choices, in small teams, in old radios, in the courage of a few. The island stood in the dark. Far off, the specks gathered like seeds. The story of Earth had crossed the sky. Now the harvest would begin. Cities woke to small wrong noises. Street lamps blinked like tired eyes. Traffic lights froze for a breath and then changed in the wrong order. People cursed and checked their phones. In many homes the smart speakers sang the wrong songs. In one town a bakery oven stopped at the same time every day. Cakes burned. People worried. Amina watched the feeds in the tower. The black dots on the map had grown in number. The little specks moved slow and low, like seeds on a wind. They did not roar or burn. They scanned. They took pictures in a way no human camera had seen before. The pictures were not of whole buildings. They were of small things: a street lamp pole, the bolt on a bridge, a child's toy in a park. The images looked like lists. The lab called them counts. Fear made headlines. But fear also made people act. Old radio clubs met in basements. Hobbyists with soldering irons and careful hands dug out radios that used wires and tubes. They chose old machines because the specs read modern chips too well. Tube radios had no small signatures to count. They were blind to simple warmth and wood. At a school in the city, a group of teenagers lived for old radio signals. They called themselves the Static Club. One boy, Tarek, found a fragment of the alien reply in his cracked ham radio. It was not words. It was a pattern of beats and pauses. Tarek replayed the fragment again and again. He wrote the pattern down on paper. He and his friends hummed it. A girl in the group, Maya, had an ear for rhythms. She noticed the pattern matched the way humans make heat in small things. The pattern rose with cooking fires and fell with cool metal. They took the pattern to an old physics teacher who liked puzzles. He said, "They do not count people. They count our things." They read textures, heat, and light in a very small scale. The teacher used a small oven and a metal cup. The oven warmed the cup and the cup made a small signature on an old spectrum reader. The group watched numbers move and stop. The kids cheered when the teacher showed the line that matched the alien fragment. News of their work traveled fast on message boards. Engineers and artists met online and in empty warehouses. The world used two things humans still had in supply: old tech and mad ideas. Small teams made simple machines. They made heat masks that looked like cold spots to the specs. They covered power plants in blocks that hid their true signature. They built decoy towns out of mirrors and cheap heaters. They painted whole factories with a coat that looked dull to alien eyes. They used water in new ways to scatter the scan. A ragtag team from the island joined them. The team had sailors, radio hobbyists, a retired satellite tech, and two teens from the Static Club who had driven down to help. Amina briefed them. She gave each person one task and one sentence: hide the bright things. The team laughed once and then did not laugh again. The first small victory came from something human and small. A fishing drone, an old automated device made by a university, was sent out to test the waters. It moved slow and low and had no shiny parts. When a tiny speck drifted near, the drone did not try to blast it. Instead, it used a net of copper and old insulation to trap the speck. The net was a simple thing, not strong, not made to break metal. The speck stuck like a fly in a glass jar. The team pulled the net in and found a seed-like pod. It fit in a palm. The pod had a shell that was neither metal nor rock. It hummed faintly. The pod's skin changed color with heat. When someone warmed their hand near it, the pod's surface rippled like oil. The scientists brought the pod to the island lab and did short tests. They burned a small paper near it. The pod's sensors pulsed and then dimmed. They soaked it in cold water, it tightened and showed no light. A small lamp made it glow like a slow sun. From these small tests a terrible guess formed. The pod scanned for heat patterns and tiny motion. They liked the small signs of human life and man-made warmth. They looked for kitchens and engines and lights that the beacon had shown. If a place had many small warm things, the pods marked it as useful. If a place had no small warm things, it was less interesting. The ragtag team used that truth. They taught towns to make fake cold places with mirrors, cheap heat masks, and quiet hours. They taught grandmothers to boil water on a low flame and hide the flame's pattern with wet cloths. They taught radio men to play loops of static to confuse the scans. Small towns turned their bright spots into dull blocks one night. People worked under starlight with candles and old radios. It felt like hiding a treasure. The HFY moments came not from bombs but from small stubbornness. A small village in the north used hay bales and metal shields to hide the warm engines of a grain mill. An old ship used wet sails and leather to hide a radio mast. A school used children's laughter in odd patterns to baffle the pods. These were not weapons. They were tricks. They were human stubbornness in the face of a slow, strange harvest. But the pods learned fast. They adapted and tried new scans. The island lab found a chilling sign. The pods had begun to mark entire regions of the planet. The map showed a slow, dark ring forming around one continent. The ring was not a wall. It was a grid of dots in the sky that made a slow shadow. People under the ring felt things differently, radios sang in wrong keys and birds flew odd routes. On one morning the news feeds showed a live image from above. The ring's shadow lay over a continent. Planes were held on the ground. Borders closed. The world watched in a cold silence. The ring did not burn or shake. It sat like a heavy net and read what lay below. Amina stood on the lab deck and watched the sea. The pod sat in a glass jar beside her. It seemed smaller now that it had shown its power. She thought of the static club kids and of the fishing drone that had nabbed the pod. She thought of the small things humans loved, a mug, a music box, a streetlight. The pods did not care for stories or songs. They counted things. In the sky above the ring, small lights shifted and formed patterns like eyes closing and opening. The world had found a new way to measure value. The lab received one more short message, a list of images the pods had taken that day. The list had no names, only items and numbers. Next to one number was a small mark. It showed a child's toy and a number, 1. Amina's hands tightened on the railing. Her voice was small as she told the team, they test. They count. We hide. But they choose next. She did not know who they would choose. She only knew the pods were learning how to read the small things humans could not bear to lose. The sky hummed. The ring waited. The pods kept their slow count. A new day had begun, and the harvest moved with patient, hungry eyes. The ring over the continent did not shout. It sat like a slow shadow. Planes stayed on the ground. Ships slowed at port. Trucks were stopped at borders. Markets emptied. People bought only what they needed. The days felt smaller. The world learned a new fear, being useful to a thing that could choose. Leaders met in tall rooms and basements. They argued into the night. Some wanted to fight with force. Others wanted to hide. Amina watched the meetings on the lab screen. She heard the words and the numbers. Food supply lines were thin. Power plants could fail. People grew tired and small. Scientists at many labs worked fast. They looked at the pod and the tests from the static club kids. They found the pod's weak point. The alien scans loved small heat and small motion. They were bad at reading big, uniform heat or strange noise. Where human life made many tiny blips, the pods saw a feast. Where heat looked even and dull, the pods saw nothing. From that truth a plan was born. The world would make itself look useless. Cities would pretend to be dead. Bright things would be hidden or changed to look cold. Factories would speak with fake signals that said, empty. Power plants would be masked. Hospitals would learn to hide their machines. The plan needed skill, speed, and tricks. A major city volunteered to show the way. It was a place full of lights and sound and food. The city had artists, engineers, and old farmers who still knew how to work without power. They chose one night. They called it the Great Quiet. People were told to turn off lights, to hide warm engines, to cover windows with thick cloth. Cars moved at dawn and then slept. Street vendors closed. The city became, for a while, a hollow shell. Smoke machines and mirrors were set up on the outskirts. Cheap heaters were placed far from the center to draw the pod's attention. Old radios played loops of static and child songs in odd beats to confuse the scans. The city's tall towers wore fake coats that reflected heat and hid the real signatures. The plan was small and brave. It worked for a time. The pods scanned the city and found little. Their images showed empty roads, dark windows, and dull factories. The world cheered. For a few weeks fewer specks came. The ring's grid slowed where the city hid. Humans had bought time. The victory did not come without cost. Small towns and farms paid the price. To fool the pods, the city needed cheap heat sources far away. Villages were asked to host fake food centers and old heaters. Their lights would burn to make far-flung places look warm. In many towns, people slept in cold barns so the city could shine. Some leaders sent buses with blankets and food and then left the towns thin and tired. Not everyone agreed. A mayor in a border town refused to help. He said his people would not be used as bait. Another leader traded supplies for shelter and sealed a road that a neighbor needed. Old rivalries found new life. In a small valley, a family kept their own stove burning and hid it in the cellar. Soldiers took their home's location and set a guard. A neighbor's home went dark and cold for weeks. The moral cost cut deeper than the cold. People who had been asked to host decoys felt betrayed later. They had given their warmth and risked their lives. Many lost power forever when a pod returned too close. Some towns were marked and never cleared. The world argued about fairness on live channels. Some called it necessary. Others called it cruel. A new human weapon rose from grief and need. Engineers built field devices that could scramble the pod's small heat reeds. They were crude at first. Old car parts, tin cans, and kitchen coils became generators of false warmth. The devices made a place look large and even, confusing the scans. They called them heat masks. Volunteers carried heat masks across borders. They wrapped power plants in them. They hid hospitals with them. Heat masks cost fuel and skill. They broke often and needed constant care. The HFY moments were quiet. In a small border crossing, a group of volunteers used a pile of old blankets and mirrors to mask a truck full of children and milk. A retired mechanic fixed a heat mask with glue and hope. A teacher in a bomb town taught kids to sing in rhythms that made the pods pause. Not swords or guns, but human stubbornness and old hands saved lives. Then the pods changed their method. They sent tiny probes lower and slower. They began to test houses and rooftops. They counted again and again. The maps grew marks numbers next to images. Some marks were low. Some were high. A high mark meant the place had many small things the pods valued. One night a mistake happened. A child in a small coastal town found a tin whistle. He had been told to keep silent. He was tired of hiding, and the whistle sounded like the sea. He put it to his mouth and blew one clear note. The whistle's sound was pure and warm. It moved through the room and up into the sky. The pod above the town took the note. It marked the sound and the small heat of the child's breath. The lab on the island watched and saw the number jump next to the toy's image. The number was a mark the pods used to choose. In a cold place far beyond the planets, something old and heavy woke. The hidden ship in the Kuiper belt shifted. It had been asleep inside ice and quiet for ages. It had listened. It had been waiting for a pattern that matched its memory. The child's whistle did not need to be loud. It only needed to be human. Sensors in the deep field showed motion. The hidden ship's engines, long cold, began to stir. It rolled like a sleeping animal and pointed a long nose toward the inner system. The lab screens flashed a single word, awaken. Amina felt the room go thin. She thought of the great quiet and the towns that had given their warmth. She thought of the child and his whistle. She thought of the pod and its slow count. The masks had worked, but small things still mattered. Outside the lab window, the sky held the ring like a lid. On the other side of the planet, the hidden ship moved. The harvest had changed scale. It was no longer only seeds in the wind. It had become something that could wake and decide. Amina tightened her hands on the railing. She felt the weight of choices. The plan had saved cities and lost villages. The world had hidden itself, learned to cheat the count, and paid a price for hope. Now an ancient ship moved. It had heard the true pulse of Earth and it was coming to see. The hidden ship turned like a slow animal waking at the edge of the system. It rolled its long belly and pointed a long nose toward the sun. The Kuiper ice that had held it melted in small cracks. Inside, engines that had not burned for ages blinked and breathed. The ship smelled of old metal and cold dark. News from deep space came fast now. The cluster of specks grew bolder. The pods moved closer to cities that had tried to hide. The ring tightened in places. People sat in rooms with windows blacked out and counted time by the sound of a kettle. Fear was thick, but so was a new kind of stubbornness. Leaders met and spoke in hurried voices. They had maps and plans and lists of things they could lose. Amina stood before another meeting. Her face was tired, but her voice was steady. She did not want war. She wanted a way to trick the count. She wanted the world to keep its small things. Her plan was strange. It mixed old tools and human heart. It used sound, heat masks, decoy towns, and one odd idea, art as a weapon. If the pods counted small warm things as value, then value could be confused. If the world made many shallow, useless signals and hid the real ones inside deep patterns, the pods might mark the planet as useless. Or they might go after the false things and leave the real ones alone. The plan had three parts. First, a great field of decoys would lead the pods away. Engineers and volunteers built millions of small devices, cheap heaters, mirrored plates, burned out engines that only looked alive. They made towns of mirrors on the open sea. They left small lights and radios on old ships like bait. Second, they would use sound and laughter as code. Musicians, children, and old radio men recorded songs and rhythms that made no sense to a scanner but made perfect sense to human ears. These songs were played on repeat across many fake signals. Third, a small fleet would use ancient drives, old experimental engines kept in dry docks. They were not strong enough to fight a ship, but they could move in odd ways. Volunteers from many places came. The Static Club kids helped. The fishing captain who had seen the circle joined too. Sailors put mirrors on rafts. Artists painted fake roofs on warehouses. Old mechanics fixed heat masks until they hummed like bees. The world pooled what it had: hands, wood, old songs, and courage. The hidden ship reached the edge of the inner system with a slow, hungry intention. It scanned the planet with a curiosity that looked like hunger. The pods streamed out like seeds and checked every fake light and mirror. At first the plan seemed to work. The pods fell on the mirror towns and tangles of heaters. They marked these as rich. They moved away from the true cities. Then the hidden ship did what machines do when confused. It sent a question into the sky. The question was a pattern, a test. It asked, which of these signals is true? The pods checked faster. They found patterns in the songs. They found the odd rhythms that children made and started to sort them. The counting grew crueler. Amina watched as a pod marked a decoy port with a high number. The fake port had been built on purpose. It drew the pod like iron. A trap sat waiting nearby. A small fleet guided by volunteer captains moved in. These ships had no big guns. They had only nets made from old copper and strange coils that hummed. They were not weapons. They were confusion tools. When the pod came close, the nets closed. The coils sent a pulse that made the pod's surface ripple. The pod did not die. It froze like a bird in a hand. The nets pulled it into a small cage and sealed it with an odd heat signature. The pod's lights dimmed and then blinked in a new pattern. It was not the end, but it was a catch. The small victories multiplied. More pods were netted. Many were captured and examined. Scientists learned how to change a pod's reading with salt and sound. They learned that the pods could be tricked by odd, even, and impossible patterns. An old singer from a hillside town sang a note that bent the pod's scan for a second. The pod recoiled as if it had been lied to. But the ship was awake. It had sent out more than pods. It had a central mind, or at least a place that felt like one. The mind watched the traps and learned. It began to test real cities again. It pierced a false quiet and sent a wave of seed specks to a real hospital. Panic rose and hands shook. In the darkest hour, When some towns had already been marked and lost, a desperate move began. A group of pilots took a small squad of ancient drive ships. They could not fight. They could only move oddly and make strange signatures. The pilots turned their engines and dove toward the hidden ship. They did not go to die. They went to confuse the counting with paradox. The pilots played the recorded songs on their radios at full blast. They looped children's laughter, old lullabies, and clocks ticking out of time. The hidden ship's scanners tried to make sense of the noise. It did not understand the human paradox, songs that made less sense when repeated, laughter that broke the pattern of heat, music that carried 100 small differences. The ship's logic stuttered. That stutter grew into a pause. The pods began to shift aim. They followed the strange fleet rather than the real cities. They moved into the field of mirrors and heaters. For a terrible hour Earth held its breath while the pods searched false bounty. Then the ship made a choice. It could not take everything. It could not know what was best. It slowed. Its engines burned a long bright line and then dimmed. The pods began to return to their ship like birds to a nest. The cluster gathered like a web pulling in. The world did not win without pain. Many towns and homes had been taken. The fields where decoys burned low were scarred. People wept for what they had lost. But the great cities that held millions of lives were largely safe. Hospitals still stood, though thin. Food lines moved again. The ring in the sky retreated like fog. The hidden ship did not fire a weapon or make war. It left. It moved back beyond Pluto and then further. The pods followed slowly and then not at all. The ship did not vanish. It watched from a long distance, like an animal that had tasted a new place and left to think. In the weeks that followed, the world rebuilt. Small towns that had given warmth were given aid. Nations argued and made new pacts. The beacon tower on the island was not destroyed. It had been secreted away and rebuilt into something new. It became both a warning and a shield. Amina and the Static Club rewired the beacon to carry not only songs, but patterns that meant, we are many. We are not simple. On a quiet night, Amina climbed the tower and put a small recorder into the beacon's memory. She played a single laugh, a laugh from the boy who had found the whistle. She added a thin line of code that hid the laugh inside Static. The note would be a secret. It would be a promise. She pressed send. The beacon's light blinked once. It sent out its tiny dish of sound into the dark. The world watched and waited. Far away, the hidden ship listened. It did not come back. It changed its mind. For now. Amina looked at the sky and felt a human kind of pride. They had been counted. They had almost been taken. They had lied, hidden, sung, and given. In the end, they had used the strangest human tool of all, heart. She whispered into the night, "You found us. We will not be easy to count." The beacon kept its steady beat. The earth kept its songs. The harvest had paused. The future would ask for more courage. But for one night, the world slept under a dimmed sky and the small sounds of people who would not be counted.